I think we'll try and get started since it is about 12 o'clock, and if other folks come in here, that's fine. Thanks very much for being with us for the latest in our series of conversations on the issues. Today, joining us is Milwaukee County Executive Scott Walker. It's good to have you here today.
Good to be here, Mike.
Quick bio, a little hot there, but a quick bio. County Executive Walker first was elected to office, I think, back in 1993.
Yeah,
wasn't
very
it?
good memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the Assembly, and was elected county executive in 2002, following the pension scandal here in Milwaukee County. You'll release your budget tomorrow. Mm-hmm. It's not very often that an elected official gets to write his own headline, but give us the headline that you think is the big news in the budget this year.
Well, I think the interesting thing, maybe in contrast to the one we saw the other day with the city, is we're investing more in the law enforcement and at the same time not raising the property tax levy. I know the other day on Sunday the story was about putting more cops on the street, but also seeing the property tax levy go up. I've made a commitment, no great surprise to people, that I'm not going to increase the levy yet again for the sixth straight budget. But we're also making a commitment to supporting the sheriff and a lot of other areas in public safety, and realizing the way to do that is by making that your priority. Then whether or not state aids come or go or anything else happens, as long as public safety is a priority for us, we're going to find a way to fund it.
Is the fact that for the sixth budget in a row you're going to not propose an increase in the tax levy, is that symbolism? Is it, I mean, how significant? The county board always raises the tax levy anyhow, year after year.
Well, the interesting thing about that, though, if you look at statistically over the last 5 prior budgets, I've always introduced no increase. The board in 3 of those 5 actually put a significant increase on that. And in 2 of them, the first one, it was less than 1/2 of 1%. One of them, right before the last election they had, back going in 2004, was no increase. They kept it at the same level. But 3 of the others, including last year's, they raised. But if you average it out over those 5 years, I've asked for 0. They've added some levy. I put some vetoes on. They've overridden some of those vetoes. The average annual increase has been less than 2%. So from that regard, I'd say to the average taxpayer, to the retired senior citizens living in Sherman Park, to the young family just starting out with a new mortgage and a new child, to the entrepreneur trying to start a new business here in Milwaukee County, to those people who really don't have the capacity to see 6-7% increases like they saw in the past, keeping that to 2% or below, I think, is a victory, and we have changed the debate.
You said this requires tough choices. What have been the toughest choices that you have had to make in putting together this year's budget?
Well, I think for us, a lot of times it involves employees. We've got a lot of great people who work for the county, and anytime you make decisions about employees being internal or looking to other alternatives, that's a challenge because you're dealing with real people's lives, and you got to be cognizant of that. We've tried as much as possible, not just this year, but in previous budgets, to do that largely through attrition. There's about 20% fewer full-time equivalent employees today than there were 5 years ago. Most of those were people who retired. No great surprise. A lot of them retired early in 2002 and 2003 because of the pension enhancements that were the start of this whole debate to begin with. But we've tried to minimize the number of outright layoffs and abolishments. But in this budget, there are some. But I give you a good example where it makes sense to do that if you're ultimately going to say, how as stewards of the public's money, how do we best use that? And our first and ultimate goal shouldn't be an employment agency. It should be providing core services. The parks is a good example. In the proposal Sue Black, our parks director, gave to us, we eliminate 81 positions. 50 of those are filled. They're entry-level positions within the parks. We create 20 new higher skill forestry type positions, and then we put about $600,000 in the seasonal employees. Well, that saves us thousands and thousands and thousands, over $15,000 a year, not dollars, excuse me, that saves us millions of dollars, but saves us thousands of additional hours of work that we get, over 15,000 hours more of work under the new plan versus the old one, because we've got seasonal employees versus year-round employees, and we get to use them in the times when we need them the most, in May and June and July and August. Now, it's tough because you're still dealing with 50 people's lives, and even though those 50 can apply for those 20 jobs and other jobs out there, it's still a difficult decision.
Let's talk for a moment about the parks. Some people feel the parks in Milwaukee County are deteriorating. Do you share that opinion?
Well, I think the parks overall are doing quite well. I think there are certainly places there are challenges. People who look at some of the challenges we have this year, ironically, it's not because of a previous no tax levy increase budget. People should remember something that's not often talked about. The budget that we're operating on under for 2007 is not the budget I presented to the county board. I vetoed the whole thing last year for the first time ever. In large part because they put positions back in for the parks and only funded them at 25% of their salaries. Said it was doomed to failure, it was doomed to a deficit, it was doomed to cause problems. Well, we were able to manage the fiscal side of it, but it still poses some real challenges for the park staff, as it does in a couple other areas where they did the same thing. I think people, if they look at a problem this year, any of the challenges we've had in the parks, assume it must be because of our tax-freeze budgets. Again, in this case, the budget is entirely one the county board presented with a tax levy increase, and yet it has its challenges because they did a little smoke and mirrors. They said, well, we're going to put these back in, but we're not going to make the tough choice to make that spending decision from elsewhere in the budget. They put them in and only funded 25%. We're not going to make decisions like that. We're going to be very clear about how we fund them and clear that they can sustain them year-round.
I think last year you said your ultimate hope was to establish a parks district like a lot of other communities have. Are you any closer to seeing that vision realized?
No, unfortunately. I'd like to see that. I mean, we've got authors in the state legislature, we've got Republicans and Democrats, but it's still, you know, with the, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the state budget itself pending. Almost every other piece of legislation is ultimately at a standstill. But long term, that's the right decision, to have an independently elected parks district. They have some 300 of them in the state of Illinois. The Twin Cities has several, Oakland, Ohio, other places have them. And it's really not just about the current challenges the county has with the pension, but the ongoing challenges that we have with state mandates. If you look back to 1980, at that time, about 45% of the county's tax levy went to the park system. 20 years later, 2 years before I came into office, that number had dropped below 10%. That's because every time the state mandates another program in the courts, another program in social services, without providing funding for the counties, not just Milwaukee County, but any county, the reality is one of the few places they've turned to in the past that has an abundance of tax levy is the park system. If you want the parks to be free of the burden of state mandates and also of pensions and other legacy costs that the county has, really the only true way to do that is by separating it out with an independently elected park district.
Let's talk for a moment about transit on a couple different fronts. In your budget proposal, you'll propose an increase in bus fares from I think $1.75 to $2. That'll put it right at the top around the country in terms of price. Is that fair to the folks who must rely on county buses for their travel to work and home?
Well, and you mentioned work and home and school, I would throw in the mix. And what we heard is when the transit system came back, and the lion's share of their reason for challenges isn't because of the property tax levy, it's because of the cost. A lot of people may not know this, but the transit system isn't a county department. We contract with MTS Incorporated, so all the operators of the transit system are all separate employees that work for them, the management and everything else. They have about $10 million worth of incurred cost, wages, benefits, retirement packages, and one of the biggest pieces, fuel costs, just like everyone else who needs transportation, be it a bus, a car, a truck, or anything else out there. All those things add up to about $10 million. Only about $800,000 is because of the amount that we ask every department to share to keep the property tax levy frozen. And so they came back and they said, we're going to cut about a dozen routes, we're going to change some other routes, we're going to cut back on paratransit, which is the specialized service that provides for people with physical and developmental disabilities, and shrink that service area down, and we're going to propose raising fares. And we held public hearings, public sessions all across the county, and what we heard overwhelmingly, as much as riders didn't want a fare increase, they said to a person, we'd prefer paying a fare as long as we don't see a route eliminated or our service area reduced. And so we stuck another $4 million from outside of the transit budget, from other parts of our budget, into transit's budget for this year's 2008 budget proposal, just so we could restore paratransit to the area it is now, so nobody who moved in thinking, if I live here and it's 0.8 of a mile from a transit route, I'm going to be covered now under the transit system's proposal wouldn't have been. We said that's not fair, that's unrealistic. The same thing with someone saying, well, I'm going to live here and I'm going to work at this place because I know there's a bus route. When we eliminate that, you don't give them the opportunity to do that. So in terms of fairness, what people said is don't eliminate the bus routes, and if you can find some extra change, we wouldn't mind not seeing the fares go up. But long term, we've got to find a solution. In Chicago, they're looking at going from $2 up to $2.50, and they added in the past a 1% sales tax, which they're now proposing going up to 1.25%. What that suggests to me is you can't tax your way, you can't fare increase your way out of a solution. Ultimately, to find the real solution to this issue, we've got to find a better way to control cost. And I'd like to see us consolidate management of systems across the region, and I'd like to see us do more to control the contracts that we have that are much more generous in many cases even than county government is.
You raised something, and I'll go back to talking about transit in a moment, but you talked about the city of Chicago, and one of the things they're looking at. There are county supervisors who frankly would like to see the public vote on a penny tax on the dollar, so that money could be generated to pay for bus service or parks or whatever. You've been adamant in your opposition to that, so you don't think it should be the subject of a public vote. What's the harm in having a public vote on that from your perspective?
Sure. Well, for one thing, it's advisory. It'd be a lot different if you could say to the public, to everybody in this room, what do you think about that, and it actually meant something. But this is only an advisory vote. There's nothing that holds the legislature, certainly, but even the county board or the county executive in the future of this vote, it's nothing more than an advisory vote. And for anyone
I think it's a waste of time.
Well, yeah, it absolutely is a good example. Last spring, 69 of the 72 counties in the state held advisory referendum votes on the issue of state mandates in the courts and the social services. Overwhelmingly, in every one of those counties, but by massive margins, the voters approved those. In this budget cycle, the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly, so both parties, every angle out there, not only didn't listen to that call for relief from mandates, they actually increased the cost of mandated services in this budget. So I look at that and say those were only advisory referendum questions. If something as widespread as 69 of 72 counties could pass these and it didn't have an impact, what you really need to do is talk about things that have a direct impact and can actually force people to do things. And so one, a vote, just advisory doesn't do you anything. It just kind of diverts attention from the real challenge. But secondly, even if it was a vote straight up or down on a sales tax, again, I'd point to Chicago. Chicago, the people who pushed that sales tax years ago at 1%, which is larger than many are talking about just for transit. Here, they're talking about 1% for transit, so-called property tax relief, public safety, and the parks. In that case, they said it would solve all the problems. Well, here we are. They're talking about needing another 0.25%, and they're talking about fares going up to $2.50. Again, I believe you can't tax your way out of a problem. You can only control cost, and then that in turn allows you to control the situation. The other problem is past history. On property tax relief in particular, in 1991, the members of the county board passed a 0.5% sales tax increase at that time with the promise written right into the resolution that said this is for property tax relief. From 1992 to 2002, property taxes went up 55%. To me, it's just a hollow promise.
Let's go back to transportation for a moment. Mayor Barrett has his own vision of what he thinks the transportation environment should look like in this community. It includes what he calls a connector, or there are different names for it, but it's essentially streetcars that would take you around to downtown destinations, about a 3-mile route, but also improvements in bus service. You want all money in terms of improvements spent on buses. Other cities around the country seem to be going more in the direction of light rail, and I know you visited some of those cities. Why do you remain steadfast in your opposition to any form of commuter rail?
Sure. A couple different reasons. I mean, the good news, the optimistic news, and I'm an optimist, you have to be in my job, is the mayor and I agree on 50% of what he's proposing. I do believe there should be a bus rapid transit system. It should be something that upgrades and improves the current bus system and ultimately makes it more effective and more attractive, not only to current riders, but to potentially new riders. And in terms of comparisons to other cities, really in the 90s, the wave, the trend out there was to go to light rail or other rail-based systems. If you look now in the late 2000s, there's about 20 cities, including a number of them who have light rail right now, who are going increasingly In fact, Denver, one of the cities we visited, their newest line that they're proposing is a bus rapid transit line between Boulder and downtown Denver, because the community, the people that wanted to use it, asked for that over a light rail line. The reason is you can increasingly, with bus rapid transit, and that route we proposed, one of them would go right by here, right by the front on Wisconsin Avenue, all the way through downtown and up to UWM and out to the west to the Regional Medical Complex and the Medical College of Wisconsin. But you can set, with all the technology, you can think rail and really use buses by using new hybrid buses, have a more energy efficient, more environmentally effective system. You can have all the benefits of reduced travel time with designated lanes and new technology that you do with a rail system, but with the huge advantage both in cost and effectiveness of a rubber-tired system, so that when, for example, Northwestern Mutual creates a campus down in the south end of the county on 27th Street, and then suddenly in the Wheaton Franciscans build a hospital another mile down, you don't have to spend millions of dollars to build a rail-based system to expand that route. You just add another stop, which costs you a few $1,000s, and suddenly you've got that group in the loop. To me, it's much more efficient. And in the case of the mayor's specific proposal, I think not only do I disagree with it, I think it would be fundamentally wrong for the people who use the bus system to have a competing system that goes through a 3-mile radius of downtown Milwaukee when we need the money desperately to improve and upgrade the current bus system.
So where do you see room for compromise if you remain opposed to that, and the mayor says, hey, I'm willing to, I endorse the idea of buses to some extent.
Yeah.
Where's the room for compromise?
Well, he's got a very similar system. He calls it a Comet system. It's got some of the same routes. What we've suggested is our original proposal, because my view is a little bit different than a lot of bureaucrats and a lot of politicians. I don't want to spend all the money on once on something that hasn't been proven yet in Milwaukee. I want to pilot something. So we've got 2 pilot projects, one north-south, one east-west. We'd be even willing to adjust if the mayor and the city thought those routes should be somewhat different. But to take a portion of that money, our proposal spends only $59.5 million of the $91.5 million total still left from the federal ICT funds, to spend that on a bus rapid transit system that the mayor and I can agree on, and say, let's fight another day on the remaining $30+ million that's out there. Maybe he can convince somebody somewhere in the future that they should spend it on the streetcar. But for now, we both agree, I think pretty much everybody agrees, that bus rapid transit makes some sense. Let's spend it on a couple pilots. Let's go on routes we can mutually build a consensus on, and then have that debate in the future about whether or not there should be a rail system.
And ultimately, this will be hammered out by who? The Regional Transit Authority, or how does this end?
Well, in the end, I think as long as Tom and I are both in our positions, we'll still want to have some control over that, even if there is an RTA or something like that in the future. But it's one of those where I just tend to think we're a lot closer than media give us credit for. It's just a matter of what's the right venue and how do we go about making that compromise. But to me, a compromise isn't saying, you know, you each have positions that are out here, and one should come all the way over to a position that person doesn't agree with at all. It should be, let's take the things we agree on and move forward on those, and then come back and debate the other things later.
Let me ask you a question or two about pensions. As many of you know in this room, I mean, the pension scandal in Milwaukee County is really the scandal that keeps on giving.
Or taking.
Yeah, or taking. But, I mean, you swept into office on, really on taxpayer uprising. And yet, one of the first stories that was done about the original pension scandal, about these very lucrative pensions that were being given to county employees and county managers, was done by Bruce Murphy. And this past week, and I'll bring out my reading glasses for this because I don't see so well anymore, but Bruce Murphy wrote something in Milwaukee Magazine. He's now the editor of Milwaukee Magazine. And he kind of held your feet to the fire on this in light of the latest allegations by the newspaper, the latest reporting by the newspaper that indicates that pensions are still a big problem, and that these buyback provisions that allow county employees to spend a certain amount of money and get credit for perhaps very limited work done when they were maybe in high school and working in the parks, and then allows them to enhance their pensions by pretty substantial amounts. He wrote an editorial that essentially says, last week, County officials announced the hiring of 2 top attorney investigators to check the legality of pension credits and special benefits given over the decades and report back to the county. His question is, he said, you've probably seen this, isn't this why we first elected Scott Walker on April 30th, 2002? He's going to clean up the pension mess. Instead, he is obsessed about freezing taxes, which has a short-term impact on the budget, while dilly-dallying on the long-term fiscal impact of the various pension sweeteners. And I think his final comment was, at a certain point, you have to take ownership of the government you run. And so 5 years after Walker's glorious revolution, his words, he's finally taking action. I have you respond to that. At some point, does any of the blame for this continuing problem rest with you, or how do you feel about that?
Well, a couple different things. One, if you look at, going back 5.5 years now to what was happening at the time, the things that were identified, we addressed. I mean, we fundamentally changed the pension board so that no one entity controls all of them, because part of the problem was concentrated power, even in the things that have come up recently, were part of the things that clearly were identified as part of the challenge. We've taken a step further. We put in people with financial backgrounds without conflicts of interest, which we saw all too often in the past. So we put in place a good firm pension board. We allowed a broader spectrum of people to make appointments, the county board chairman, there are retirees involved, as well as active employees who are part of the system. And we went through a process starting with our non-represented employees, and eventually last year all the way through the last group to go through the collective bargaining contract with a union, where we capped off the lump sum backdrop. We had waivers go through that required anyone who was an at-will ECP level employee who worked for me or worked in my cabinet had to waive away their benefits before they went through. We did a number of these things to address this. We've taken other actions to make sure that this sort of thing couldn't happen again in the future. And in the case of the story that really broke through the Journal Sentinel this summer with the buyback and buy-in program, the interesting thing about Bruce being the one raising that topic is the person that he used as his primary source in those early stories back 5.5 years ago, the former retirement director, someone who he all but sainted in a number of his columns, is the primary nemesis for what created the buy-in and buyback. And he'll admit that. I called him on it recently about that. The fact that the guy who'd been in that position was largely to blame for this buy-in and buyback program. And part of the reason why we called on the pension board to bring in outside legal and other counsel to look more fully at this is it even doesn't even go back. We're not even going to invoke Tom Amit's name. It goes back to Dave Schultz and others some 15, 20 years into the past. And this particular individual I referenced, who literally took actions that not only didn't involve the county executive or the county board, but bypassed in a recorded vote of the pension board. So, sure, you could point, with 2020.
Do you believe those actions are criminal?
Well, I think in many cases they are. And in part, what we're trying to sort out is we think some of them are direct IRS violations. We think some of them are potentially criminal, although question in some cases, if you're going back 15 to 20 years, is there a statute of limitations, and if so, has it run out? And there probably are some at the other end of the spectrum who bought into that program who probably do so legitimately. I'll give you an example, and we haven't sorted this all out, but if you look in the private sector, someone works part-time for a couple years in a particular program and then gets a full-time job and stays there for the next 20 years. Many companies in the private sector allow them to buy in for partial or full retirement benefits. That's not unheard of. Most people would say for the amount that you got in a payment for that buy-in, if you went out and invested it, you at worst break even, you might actually make a little bit of money off of that investment. Those cases might be worth looking at and saying those are legitimate to keep. The problem we don't know is because this guy and the people involved at the time, even the legal counsel in the county, never did an actuarial review, never did any diagnosis of this, never allowed the pension board to fully vote on it. We don't know what the true financial impact of that is. And certainly, in some regards, should we have been more cynical about everything and anything possible related to county government? Sadly, that appears to be true. But the fact of the matter is, every time we have found a problem, instead of creating a blue ribbon commission and pushing it off somewhere in the future, we've taken it head on. We brought in professionals. We brought in objective, transparent sources to get to the bottom of things, and I'm confident we're going to do it again here.
Let me talk for just a couple of moments about your political future. You haven't announced yet for county executive, but we're all assuming that's a fait accompli. Is it? When will you announce?
Well, clearly with the budget coming out tomorrow, and as you know, with the process going through the middle of November, one of the things I like to do is keep the focus clearly on the budget process and on me and on the county board. So for me, anything to do with politics, campaigns, and that really takes the focus off. At some point after the budget's complete, some of my decision-making process, the final decisions I like to make on that are going to evolve around how this process goes. If for some reason we could go back to how we were in 2003 as we went into the 2004 budget, where the board and I worked together, where we respected the rights of people in this community who are concerned about raising property taxes, and who are concerned about, as we just talked about, pensions and other benefits, and saying, I don't want my taxes to go up to pay for those, because they're not going to go for parks, they're not going to go for transit. Any tax increases, sales tax or otherwise, is really going to go to pay for those benefits unless we make more tough decisions in those legacy cost area. If we can get to the point where I feel confident that we can move forward on that, well, then in some ways my mission is accomplished. If, on the other hand, we go through a tough budget process where I feel, if not all, at least many members of the county board don't get the significance of what this impact means on the local taxpayer, the local business owner, the people who really make things work day in and day out in this community, well, then I'm going to look at that and say, my job's not done here. I need to step forward just as I did 5 years ago when I said I was willing to take Tom Ament on and do the same thing here for a couple more years to get the job done.
So are you saying it's possible you might not run?
Well, yeah, if we were, I don't, as much as I joked about this once before, as much as the retirement benefits are pretty good at the county, I don't plan on retiring in county government. And whether it's with a run again or not, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life, certainly not my political or public service career in county government. And even if I chose to run, probably would look at this as being the last term to get the job done, with the clear focus on getting things done and completed over the next few years so we could hand it off to a new generation of leaders. Because I think part of the problem you saw with my predecessors, you get to 10, 12 years in the office and you start getting complacent and you start not really being aggressive in moving things forward. And I think that's one of the challenges we have to assess out there. But for me, as much as that's the case, and the other part really ties into who is on the horizon. Who are the leaders that might come up there? Right now, the people I hear talking about wanting to provide leadership, at least in an executive position, to the county are people who take that direction, that kind of reform, that kind of relief and restoring trust in the public in the exact opposite direction where I think we want to go. And so that will play a role as well.
Let's look at the immediate horizon. Who do you think your likely challenger or challengers will be? And are you, as some Democrats now suggest, vulnerable?
Anybody who's on the ballot is vulnerable. Anybody who assumes they're not vulnerable has lost touch with reality and lost the fact that people in this room who live in this county are ultimately my employers. And the second you start taking anything for granted is the second you lose your edge, and you're probably vulnerable politically, not just vulnerable in general. So anybody who faces the voters as on the ballot is vulnerable, in the same way that when we all go for interviews, whether it's for law school or whether it's for a job, whether it's for clerking or a law firm or anywhere else out there, you want to be a little nervous. You want to have a little edge to make the case that you're going to be just as powerful and strengthful as possible. Excuse me. I think in our case, statistically, this is a nonpartisan position, but I think anyone politically, at least, who doesn't know I'm a Republican, and any of the potential candidates who are running, it will probably be not just Democrats, but liberal Democrats, need only look at the numbers, and statistically, this is a county that traditionally votes overwhelmingly Democrat. I've been able to overcome that not once but twice, because we've tried to be a straight shooter. We've tried to talk about issues that we think resonate with people regardless of party. We're going to do that again. There's already one official candidate, Joe Klein, nice guy.
Ran last time.
He ran last time, got a couple percentage points through the primary. Son actually is in my son's scout troop, so nice guy, appreciate him, but probably not going too far in the future. But the other, I think it's clear that it's pretty clear that the pack has been cleared by folks in Madison. They told Mike D'Amato to get out of the way. They told John Richards to get out of the way. And it seems like, although she seems to be going back and forth on an official announcement, but State Senator Lena Taylor appears to be the likely opponent. And whether or not it's an official announcement or not, we anticipate she's going to be in the race. And we anticipate, though bigger than her, our real opponent's going to be groups from outside of Milwaukee, groups that spent a lot of money, like MoveOn.org did at the national level, are likely to spend money from Madison and probably from outside of the state.
Are you interested in running for Congress? There's a lot of speculation that that's what you'd like to do at some point, and when
No.
Jim Sensenbrenner says
Not at all.
not interested in running for Congress.
Even though we're in Sensenbrenner Hall, I'm not interested in his job. I love being an executive. I can understand why Tommy Thompson loved it. There's something magical about waking up every day, seeing the challenges out there, and being able to do something immediately about it. Now, some things obviously are long-term, and you're certainly not a dictator, nor should you be, but there's something great about being able to get something done each and every day that affects people's lives. When I was in the legislature, I loved it, but short-term was 6 months. And long-term could be year after year after year, and that's in a group where you could reasonably maneuver with 132 lawmakers. To be part of 435 is of absolutely no interest to me. It's a place where you can't get your hands around things, where you have to live almost a generation in office before you have any real power, any effect, with a few exceptions like my good friend Paul Ryan, who I think has a great impact. I just don't see that in the horizon.
Would you
Even though that's speculated. It's funny how
Yeah,
a lot of liberals around town know what my political. I'm not calling you one. You're very objective, Mike, and always have been. But
why,
you're.
thank you.
Well, but you're good. But Mike's a good example. I was telling him earlier. I always love because he asks me tough questions, but they're always fair. And you're picking up because you got a good barometer in the community about what people say. But I always love it when I hear in the courthouse about I'm running for Congress, or what was it last year? I was going to be the director of FEMA. I'm running away from the situation. We don't run away from anything. I think by now people should know, for a guy who left a state seat in the state legislature to step up and take on this enormous task, being safe isn't something I'm worried about. Doing the right job is. And in this case, going to Washington to run something, although some might argue I've experience in taking over disasters, but FEMA or anything else isn't of any interest. And certainly, as much as I respect the members of Congress, that's just not an area I'm interested in.
How about governor? Would you run for governor again if the circumstances were right?
Well, I'm going to focus on being the best executive I can be here, and if I run again, I'm going to focus on that. Just as I did in the Assembly, where I didn't preclude anything, I'm certainly going to do that. Obviously, I had an interest a few years back because I thought this governor, despite the rhetoric, wasn't cutting it for Milwaukee County. I have similar concerns right now, but who knows? On the horizon, things can change, and I worked well with the person who's the governor when he was the Attorney General. Things seemed to change a little bit when he became the governor, but if I saw a change, maybe that would change my perspective. But right now, not just on tax and spend issues, but on things specific to county government, I don't see the leadership out there right now, and that might be an option. I think another option will be potentially taking a leadership position with the other county executives and administrators from around the state to try and put a focus on some of these key issues with juvenile justice, with the court system, with social services, not to ask for more money necessarily, but to say, give us the tools to free up our hands so that we can actually deal with them.
I'll look at my watch here. I think we are about halfway through. I want to open this up for questions from the audience because I'm sure you folks have some ideas on what you'd like to ask. Anybody have a question? We'll begin.
See, everybody's done eating, so they're comfortable to
We'll
ask questions
start
now.
with Dan back up there.
I think in general it's pretty good. Initially there was some talk by our budget staff about some significant cutbacks there. I mean, everybody's got a little bit of a nip and a tuck here or there, but I think overall the courts will be pretty good in this budget, and certainly in areas like bailiffs, which was an area of dispute before, those are fully funded in the sheriff's budget. We also take and put an account not only for the courts, but the DA, John Chisholm, who I think has done a spectacular job at just the early stages of his term. One of his great approaches is looking at trying to really bifurcate in the community between those offenders who have low, non-threatening misdemeanor type offenses and those serious felony offenses, and trying to put more of our time and resources into prosecuting and acting on those felonies. And that's why he's got assistant district attorneys out in the community at stations with the police department. For him to move more people eventually into the felony court means there also have to be some changes in there. We built into that. We're looking ahead to the future and saying that some of our misdemeanor courts, we've got to be prepared to change those, roll those over into felony courts. And so, for example, in our capital budget, we put more of the bullet glazing glass in and the things that you traditionally see in a felony court so that those misdemeanor courts are available as well.
Mm-hmm. Other question? Yes.
We've seen increasingly a gap between the retirement benefits that public employees are getting, including health insurance,
Yep.
versus those that the public in general
Well, and that was, the pensions is the big story for years, but part of our tremendous long-term challenge, and in a way the pensions played into that, because when the pension scandal struck and all the attention focused on that, you really accelerated the number of people who would move into the retirement system. That had a very negative impact on our budget as well, because we had a policy for a while, it's capped off now, but for anyone prior to 1994 who was hired by the county, they get free health care for life, no premium involved, and that itself was a challenge. But then you add to that, as you had this number of employees who went in, we used to have what was called a Rule of 75, where you take your age and your years of service and you match them together. And so for a lot of employees who started out maybe 19, 20 years old, working in the parks or somewhere else in the county, now suddenly they're in their early 50s, and they're eligible to retire, and because of these incredible incentives out there, they took them. Well, for now, for 15 years, if someone retired at 50, I'm carrying the full load on their health care costs, no premium on an annual basis. So monthly, I'm paying $2,000 a month, and it isn't until they reach 65 that at least Medicare pays for a portion of that. That is a huge challenge for us. The ordinances were set up that way. The benefits were set up that way. We can't completely wipe out all those things, God bless you. We can cap them. And so we've done some of that. But the other thing we did this past go-around, with the help, and I want to give them credit, some of our unions, was we started adding more in co-pays, which not only impacts our active employees, but it has a direct impact not only in sharing the costs, but also in rethinking the usage of some of these benefits. We took, just by doing those small changes last year, we were projecting 5 years out in the future that we would double the cost of our health care insurance cost. 5 years from now in 2011, we did this projection last year. We have cut that increase in half, but I'm not satisfied with that. I'd like to see us come close to flatlining that. And so that's going to mean we have to do more things like co-pays, more adjustments, more narrow networks to try and drive those health care costs down and make sure that we're not allowing future employees to get those same sort of highly generous benefits.
Mm-hmm. Questions? Yes.
Years ago, the county entered into a public-private partnership in regards to the Milwaukee Public Museum, and with the eventual goal, I think, of alleviating the financial burden completely on the county.
Yep.
As a privately financed operation. And as we know, it ran into a lot of trouble through those efforts, and the CFO was in charge. of it.
Right.
But I'm wondering if what the county's position is for the long-term future, if it's still a goal to privately finance the entire operation, or if the county sees its role as being more central into the future.
I think part of it, because of the crisis they experience, it's more a stabilization right now. And so what we're looking at is short-term and mid-range goals. We need to look and reevaluate that in terms of whether we reestablish a different long-term goal for the Milwaukee Public Museum. Certainly for years, for almost a decade after that initial transition from the county fully operating and running the museum, things ran well. But I think that was in part a tribute to a very engaged and involved board, which is a good lesson, not just the museum, but to all nonprofit boards throughout the Milwaukee area, is that serving on a board means more than just showing up for a meeting each quarter or whatever the time frame is, that there has to be a very direct hands-on role, particularly by the governing committee and the finance and audit committee and things like that. It also suggests, though, that, as you alluded to, with the CFO and the former president, but particularly with the CFO being at a point where even to the auditors, there appears to be allegedly the falsification of records. At some point, even as a good board member, how do you account for things when someone is really illegally falsifying records? It doesn't appear to be for a personal gain monetarily, but for a reputation, that kind of a gain out there. And so there's got to be further checks and balances, again, not just at the museum, but with other nonprofits out there. But now we've got to stabilize it, which is what we've done. The county board chairman and I, who don't always see eye to eye in some things, we're very united on this. We came in and put a group in charge of the finances and said not a penny gets freed up until we know exactly what's happening. We put in place a stakeholders group that said what are the next steps, brought everybody to the table, including those on the peripheral. And I think in the short term, even though they had that little blurb a week or so ago, that's really because the full impact of the county's commitment of assistance to stabilize them doesn't become effective until January 1st. But then after that, then the sky's the limit. Long term, I mean, I think after they get stabilized in a couple of years, not even just governance, but I think they have to ask about, is that the right place to do it? Are natural history museums in general the same, or do they need to change? I mean, I think even aside from this trouble, you look at a lot of museums across the country, and in this day and age where our kids can look on the internet and experience things 5 times more graphic than they experience in a static environment that we traditionally see in museums, maybe it's time for us to rethink how we present that information and find a different way and potentially even a different venue for doing that. But that's a decision we really can't make until we stabilize things. Go ahead.
Mr. Walker, I come from Detroit, where there's a long history of acrimony between the central city and the surrounding suburbs.
Mhm.
Milwaukee County is a bit different geographically because it includes both city of Milwaukee
Right.
and outlying communities. How do you see the future of city-suburb relations in Milwaukee County? And specifically, are you looking to consolidation of services as a way to make the budget more healthy?
Boy, there's a number of choice questions, and that all very good. I think, when we first were running, there were a lot of questions. Mike, you remember this in a lot of debates about regional government, metropolitan government, like you have in the most famous being Indianapolis and Marion County, but certainly Miami-Dade. You look at things there. You look at more recently in Louisville, Nashville, places like that. I think long-term, that's certainly an option out there. Although my sense has always been you need to have more regional service delivery before you can start talking about anything on a larger governance level, because I live in Wauwatosa. I just know on an individual municipality by municipality basis, there's a lot of parochial pride, and whether it logistically makes sense, whether it logically and budgetarily makes sense, telling people they're all going to be a part of the same city, county government, the same school district, any of those sorts of things, is the best way to have 5,000 people show up at a hearing. I know Wauwatosa, just when they moved the boundaries for the schools, what an issue that was years ago.
But I
do
just
think
follow up. Would it be a bad thing if Milwaukee County government went out of business?
No. If there was a way to legitimately incorporate those services into other parts of the community, no. And not that I have the right answer of how to do that, but that's something, potentially we could look at long term. There are some things we do that parallel things that the city does. There are many of the things that we do are really the arm of state government. Good example being the courts. This goes beyond just the question you had asked, but to me, statewide, not just in Milwaukee County, statewide, 55% of the court costs are picked up by the county. It goes back to the question, Dan, you had asked earlier about where we're at. Well, why is the reason that there's always a challenge? It doesn't matter who the chief judge is, doesn't matter who's the executive, there's always a little bit of pounding at budget time between the courts and the county board and the county executive. Well, the reason is because we pick up 55% of the court costs, even though we have absolutely no say realistically in how they're spent. Well, to me, I'd even be willing, unlike my predecessor who just wanted the money, I said, I'll give up the same amount, the millions of dollars I get in shared revenue. I'll be able to give up an equivalent amount for dollar exchange if the state would take that over, so that I'd never have to worry about that. Not only does that help me out in terms of never having to deal with those budget requests and increases in the future, but to me, having served in the legislature, it just makes a lot of sense. The legislature and the governor set the criminal code. The state court system is run through state government. The Chief Justice of the state of Wisconsin is ultimately, the top person when it comes to running the courts. All the judges and the DAs are state employees. They're not county employees. So all we pay for is the real estate, the support staff, and the bailiffs, all of which, again, we have no control over and don't set any priorities over. So that's a good example where if you weren't going to have it, you'd say, sure, turn that over to the state, give the money back, so it's not just an area where they say, well, don't, I want to hoard the money out there. So that's one part of it, for your question specifically. The other part, per your question, I think services, I think you could look at a more regional consolidation of law enforcement and fire service. We already see some of that in the North Shore of Milwaukee County. Why? Again, I live in Wauwatosa. The fire station in Milwaukee is a couple minutes closer to me than the one in Wauwatosa. It makes no sense why we have all these separate fire departments in the same urban area. If we lived 50 minutes from each other, it might be one thing, but when you live back to back, to me, consolidating things like public safety makes a lot of sense now and in the future. But it's tough because they each have their fiefdoms. there's 19 different police chiefs. None of them wants to give up that service, that power, that control, but long term it probably makes some sense.
Mhm. Yes.
It's been six budgets now, and I think when you look at Milwaukee County from the first came office today, there's been a huge improvement in the way the county's run, but there's still some financial problems
Absolutely.
caused by healthcare pensions. Do you see any hope that you'll be able to fix some of these financial problems?
Yeah, in a couple of different ways. Certainly some are some of the things we talked about and I think when Corey Nettles was here yesterday, I loved seeing that one point that he raised about, well, he didn't think tax freezes were necessarily a bad thing, which seemed kind of odd considering his former boss might disagree with him slightly on that. But the benefit, as I recall from seeing a little bit of the snippet from on air, was he made the point that it really puts the pressure on us local officials to be more creative, to be more innovative, to be more efficient. I think the example I gave you at the beginning about the parks, where we're actually going to put more hours of labor into the parks, but by saving a couple $1 million, is a creative way of thinking differently because we have to. We have no choice. Our only choice would be the false choice of saying if you don't raise taxes, you somehow have to gut the parks. I don't accept that choice, and so I had to be creative in finding an alternative out there. I think we can do more of that. I think it's certainly something we're open to, but I think increasingly the more time goes on, the board's going to have to be open to it. For all the talk about how the board and I differ, we've got a $1.3 billion budget, and that average average increase over the last 5 years has been 2%. So you're talking about literally just a couple $1 million each year difference between my budget and the county board's budget, and yet that's like a drop in Lake Michigan in terms of the real differences out there. So increasingly they're going to have to go along with those sorts of changes. The other part that's on the horizon that interests and mentioned at the law school is we have a case pending where the board and I are fully united on this position, and that is it came out of the criminal investigation that the Attorney General's office did years ago on the former HR director and others involved with the pension deal, and we were able later to subpoena that information and found direct evidence that reads not like a typical federal legal brief, but like a novel, like a spicy novel that talks about all the things that these actuaries did, and evidence that shows clear out that actuaries, other members of that actuarial firm in other parts of the country, clearly warned the two actuaries advising Milwaukee County not to do an open and lump sum backdrop. At the same time, they were advising former county officials that at worst this would be neutral and ideally would save the county money. Well, we think we have a slam dunk case. We think the more the evidence comes out, the clearer the case can be made. And we think that the biggest challenge for us is getting that to trial and then getting a decision out of that. But we think when we get all the way through that process, there's clear and convincing evidence to show that not only were they at fault, but that damages should be awarded. And when you look at the county's unfunded liability for the pension being recovered through those damages, that opens the door to all sorts of breathing room in future budgets. And as the question was asked before about health care, we contend it's not just the unfunded pension liability, but the acceleration of retiree health benefits that shall also be accounted for under the damages awarded in that suit as well. So if that were to help, or that were to happen, I should say, that would be a tremendous, tremendous help for in the future. But as you all know, as future and current lawyers, just winning next year in trial doesn't mean there won't be several years of appeals and other things happening as well. But it certainly would give us some light on the horizon.
Spicy novel about actuaries would be quite the thing.
Yeah.
I have conversations with people about Milwaukee County government, and they kind of go like this. They say, look, we acknowledge the fact that all sorts of horribly criminal and fraudulent things are done, and this has resulted in, legacy costs which really do hamstring Milwaukee County, and it's awful. And it's not getting better, it's getting worse, because they go up over time.
Right.
But, the scoundrels have been thrown out, and it's a poor county, and given what has been done to it, it's not reasonable to think that county government can continue on a no tax increase basis. How do you respond to that?
Well, in two regards. Part of our strategy is, as I alluded to before, is it's not just it absolutely has to be 0. I know if I started at 2%, the board would end up averaging 4%. If I start at 4, it would be 6. If wherever I move, that's going to move the board. So some of it's part of it's strategic of saying, if I keep firm at 0, they're going to add some more. We're going to end up somewhere in between. And part of it is that pressure that Corey Nettles talked about before, that at some point in the future, I'm convinced there's no way you can squeeze any more out of any innovation, out of any creative thought, out of any alternative, then maybe I'd rethink that position. But I'm not convinced we're anywhere close to that point right now. And I think any time that we can see that somehow the only way to fix things is to raise taxes, either through a property tax or a sales tax, we concede away the possibility of truly being innovative and creative in some of these things. Now, that's a little frustrating because it'd be a lot easier if you and I could just say that, and I ran the business, and I could say, this is what we're going to do. I still have to have a board that goes through things, and they have their priorities and things they want to do, and interest groups that pull them away from some of those creative solutions. But we're going to still keep pushing it, which is precisely why we talk about it here in the community. The other thing to be mindful of is that it's not just about some bumper sticker or about some, some great thing I can put up on my mantle that says I never raised property taxes in any of my budgets. While those are all, politically certainly popular things, there's a reason they're popular. And that is because the public, including an awful lot of working poor in this community, in fact, I would contend when I go to public briefings, one of the most compelling stories I ever heard at a budget briefing was a young woman, early 30s, near South Side, stopped by the United Community Center. She told me how there were 13 in her family. She had 12 brothers and sisters. She was the first one out of all of them, her name was Alma Linda Ramirez, the first one in her family to have saved up enough money to purchase her own home. She had 2 girls. She had a duplex. She rented out one part, worked the other, worked a long day to put her kids into school and to do all these things. And I thought at the tail end, I thought at this briefing, I thought, she's just going to complain about some program that potentially might be reduced, and I'm going to feel bad about it because that's how I feel, even if it has to be done. And as tears were coming down her eyes, instead of saying that, she said to me, you know what? I'm the only one in my family who's living the American dream. My kids look up to me and they're proud of me because I'm doing that. But if you, not just me, but if government keeps raising my property taxes, I'm going to have to sell this home and go back to renting, and there goes my American dream. She said, please don't raise my property taxes because I got no room for error. And to me, it's people like that. It's the retired couple that lives in Sherman Park. It's the new startup on the near South Side. It's a lot of working poor people who have the least amount of disposable income to make up for a 6 or a 7 or 8% increase in their property taxes that I'm trying to be mindful of as well. Somebody that lives in a big home, somewhere in another part of the county might be able to live with it, but those aren't the people we don't solely touch them when the taxes go up. We touch all the other people who are the backbone of this community.
Got time for 1 or 2 more questions real quickly.
I'll try to be
Alan
shorter.
here, and then we'll try and get these real quickly.
Roger, I'd like to ask you a question about access. I am old enough to have voted for Senator William Proxmire in his last campaign when he spent $185 to run for U.S. Senator. Most of that money was spent returning unsolicited money.
Right.
Today, we have mega law firms, mega access, money, money, money. But a lot of people are going to go into sole practicing firms or small firms in the area of social welfare programs, environment, elder care law. How does especially a newer attorney just starting out get some political access?
Well, I think not only for attorneys, but I think in general, even more so at the county level than even at the city of Milwaukee or the state legislature. One of the things that shocked me, having served for nearly 9 years in the legislature, even though I don't look old enough to vote, it's true, I did serve there that long, was that there are very few contacts to county officials. In fact, I know a couple of supervisors or aldermen who went from the city council or from the county board to the city council were shocked by the fact that the number of calls increased 10, 20-fold when they went to the city council. So I would contend, at least in county business, anyone who's got a vested interest, who makes contact with their supervisor, with our office, with other elected officials, will have a tremendous, compounding impact, particularly if they add a few other people who share that interest to that, it's not uncommon to have an issue where supervisors may not get more than a dozen or so responses to something on an issue out there. So for starters, that's a good place to have access there, just by emailing, by calling, by contacting, by showing up at budget briefings or town hall meetings or things of that nature. At the state level, for other elected officials, again, that can have a very powerful impact. And finding a schedule, though most, not all, but most elected officials like to have public gatherings where they have interaction like we're having right now. And the more that people can show up to those, to act, not only to ask, to advocate for your position, but also to be sensitive to the fact that these are public servants, whether you agree with them on everything out there. You know, they're in the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt would say. They're the ones putting their name on the line, and being respectful of that, not backing off your position, but being respectful of that. What I find from a lot of my former colleagues in the legislature was the easiest way to turn someone off to your point of view was to come in, you know, just yelling and ranting at them, and they could immediately dismiss you. It was the people who came in well thoughtful but respectful who were the hardest for someone to dismiss in elected office. And so the more venues you can find to interact with elected officials doing that, I think the better off people are going to be.
Real quickly.
What would you say is the difference between a rate increase on the bus and tax increase? I mean, it seems like it targets the people who can least afford. You're talking about the home ownership thing. And
Sure.
very little room. There are lots and lots of people who have very little room in the budget. It
Sure.
ends up being a tax.
Right. Well, two things on that. One, I think where fees go directly to services provided, I call them user fees, whether it's that or something else, in that they're not paying a bus fare to pay for the parks or anything else. They're paying for the cost of in fact, on each of those, the cost will go up to $2. It's more than $3 per rider that it actually costs us. So we're subsidizing each of those rides. The other thing to be mindful about the specific proposal that we have is that for someone who's in a position like you're talking about, they won't see any impact in this budget. For someone who relies for the bus each and every day, they probably today buy a weekly pass, or if they're a student, get a U-Pass or something else. Those prices don't go up underneath those budgets, underneath this budget. It's only the you or me that maybe goes once or twice a week. We'll pay 25 cents more. The frequent rider won't. And the subsidies for senior citizens, for students, for people with disabilities will continue. So that will remain intact. The same thing's true with paratransit. About 65% of all our riders are picked up with a subsidy either through senior care or through disability services. So the frequent, most vulnerable riders are the ones who are either covered already or won't see an increase.
Just to add, it's not fair to add.
That's right.
It's the really most vulnerable people who don't have a bus pass. I'm talking about the taxes on the social service agencies that help people, you know, when they come and ask for a bus ticket here and there. And I've seen more and more people, I work in
Sure.
but more and more people are just asking for bus tickets or this or that. And I think it's going to be an additional tax on all the people who help those people as well.
I'm going to wrap things up right here. As we go, two things. You were the chair of the Bush-Cheney campaign, co-chair in Wisconsin in 2004. What do you expect for Republican candidates in 2008? Are you optimistic in this state?
I think it's about as wide open as it could humanly be possible. It's the first time since 1952 you don't have an incumbent president or a vice president on the ballot. I think that's why of the main front-runner candidates in either party, you've got obviously Hillary Clinton as the first woman who's really a front-runner. You've got Obama as the first African-American who I think is a legitimate front-runner. And on the Republican side, you've got Governor Romney as a Mormon who probably is fairly unique in that category as well. I think it's wide open, and I think as much as the pundits think, for example, with Hillary it's all over, I'm not convinced of that. I think come the Wisconsin presidential preference primary in February, we may see even a few other names surface that we haven't experienced yet. I don't know who those are, but I think it's about as wide open as it can get.
Who are you backing now that Tommy Thompson is out of the race?
Tommy was my friend, and I rode a Harley behind him when he went in the Ames because I like riding Harleys. But I'm not going to get involved until it's clear to me who's going to be in. I think it's too early to figure that one out.
All right, and as someone who attended Marquette University, what lessons did you learn at this university that you use daily in political life, public service?
Actually, you know, one of my favorite classes wasn't a political science class. It was with Father Kurtz talking about philosophy and really trying to think through issues and listen to all sides of an issue. That's probably one of the most, people are probably the most surprised when they come in to meet with me that I do very little talking, even though I'm talking a lot now, but talking at meetings and try to listen to things and assess where people are coming from and try and get to the heart of what the issue is, not presume that someone's got a certain agenda so they're going to think a certain way. And I think that was something, the power of that kind of ability to think and critical thinking was something I learned here, not just from Father Kurtz's classes, but from other classes as well.
County Executive Scott Walker, thank you for being with us today.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Good format. Well, it's good getting through all this.